Joining us now to talk about the Pelicans and about the latest word that's out there regarding one of its key players is our friend Jake Madison. Does a great job with Locked On Pels. And, of course, you can follow Jake via Twitter as well, at NOLA Jake. Jake, listen, it's always a pleasure. This was a very interesting day when the Athletic report came out this morning regarding Jrue Holiday possibly being traded. And this was all about the fact that it's being initiated not by Holiday or his side, but by the Pelicans. And I guess it makes sense on several levels. First and foremost, you have a new head coach. Secondly, you have a glut of guards. And thirdly, he's the one commodity that you have that could fetch something substantial in return, correct?
Yeah, pretty much. I don't know if this is the Pelicans necessarily actively looking to get rid of him and saying they want him gone and we've got to find a deal right away. I think this is more just exploratory to some degree and saying we're going to listen to offers because he doesn't fit the timeline for the Pelicans in terms of age quite like they would like. He's, over 30. They've got a very young team and one of the youngest in the league. And frankly, it makes sense to try and maybe move on from him, get as many assets as you can, and start to really build for the future instead of kind of trying to compete and win right now, though it seems the Pelicans are kind of in that mindset a little bit. So, of course, they're going to answer the phone if someone calls, and they're not going to hang up. But I don't think this necessarily means that a trade is imminent for New Orleans and Jrue Holiday because I'm sure they would love to have him for next season, and they'd like to get into the playoffs and try and compete a little bit. And he's going to help you do that more so than anyone that you'd bring in back in return for him.
Yeah, listen, he's a good player. He's not a great player. He's a good, solid player and a solid guy. Clearly their best defender, a good but not great offensive player, a guy that has been a tweener, who could play either one of the guard spots. That's the upside. The other part of it is a young team, a new coach, 30 years old, hefty contract, and the fact, as I've said many times, they've got a glut of guards. Clearly, Van Gundy likes Lonzo Ball, and he's talked effusively about him. Therefore, he's going to run his show. And then you got Redick, who's going to be here. Josh Hart, the Energized Bunny. You've got the two youngsters, and if you like them, well, you got to find minutes for guys, right? And if you bring back the same cast minus Etuan Moore from last year, you just don't have those minutes for those guys.
I definitely think that's part of it. I'm sure they really want to give Lonzo Ball more of a starting role than he had last season to really figure out what they have in him. He's going to be extension eligible. He's going to be a restricted free agent after next season. And before you make that kind of financial commitment to him, and he's going to be looking for a lot of money, I think, in free agency when he hits that in a year. Are the Pelicans going to want to give that to him? And you don't want to do that if you have an incomplete data set or you don't have enough film or you're just a little bit unsure. If you're going to commit that kind of contract to a guy like that, you've got to know. Moving on from Jrue Holiday means he can maybe step into that role a little bit more, take on a bigger offensive load, and you can really see what you have in him, and you can feel comfortable with that decision. So kind of freeing up some space in the rotation is definitely part of it.
How much, in your mind, do you think that they like Nikhil first and foremost, and then I'll ask you about Frank Jackson?
I think they like him a lot. I think he showed a lot of flashes of what you want to see in that kind of flashing scoring guard kind of role. I don't know if he's a pure point guard, but he's definitely going to kind of fit in that mold of Jrue Holiday, that combo guard that can give you minutes at the one or the two. He's very aggressive and drives to the basket a lot, likes to really attack and try and break down a defense and play make off the dribble like that in a different vein than the way that Lonzo Ball plays. And he's got a lot of confidence. His three-point shot wasn't great this past season, and I think that brings down some of his numbers. The points per game don't look particularly good. The shooting percentage doesn't look pretty good. But if he hits it a slightly above average percentage from three, all of that kind of changes and that narrative changes around him, and he looks like a very solid young player. So I'm sure they would love to find a couple more minutes for him to get out there on the court and just play and figure things out and keep improving like he did this year.
As for Frank Jackson, he's another guy that's really a tweener, truly not a point guard, but could step in there and do it if he had to. They seem to have a lot of those type of guys, including Holiday.
Yeah, and with Frank Jackson, they're very high on his defense. They've lauded that consistently since he's been here in New Orleans. This is a guy who's a very good individual defender, one-on-one. You've seen him take on really tough assignments, like guarding Damian Lillard, guarding some of the other lead guards around the league. He's not scared to take that on, and to have a guy who can do it capably is a big, important thing, even if he doesn't give you as much or if he's not as consistent off the bench as you like him to be offensively. Having a guy that's a bit of a stopper in the backcourt is a useful rotation player to have and a useful role player to have. He's a restricted free agent. We'll see how that plays out and if the Pelicans look to bring him back too, but that is a guy that they are high on.
Visiting with Jake Madison and, of course, Locked On Pels is the podcast. All right, so we mentioned that glut at guard. If you do something with Jrue Holiday, contenders are obviously the targets. They're the ones that would be interested. We've seen a lot of scenarios, whether it's Denver, whether it's the Brooklyn Nets, whether it's the Miami Heat, because of Dragic and so forth. And we see a lot of possibilities. What would make the most sense in terms of ultimate destinations for Holiday? And the second part of that question is, what would be the best return for you? What do you think they could use the most in return? And is there any player in particular that would be the most intriguing to target?
Yeah, I think you named the obvious contenders and the teams that would jump into the Jrue Holiday sweepstakes right away. Miami comes to mind, definitely the Denver Nuggets. I wouldn't even rule out the Milwaukee Bucks making a play for him as well. And I think more importantly, the Pelicans kind of want to do right by Jrue Holiday too. There's a lot of mutual respect both between the organization and the franchise and Jrue Holiday himself, and it goes both ways. And so he's been such a good soldier for this team, the face of the franchise kind of in a way the past couple of years after the Anthony Davis trade request and all of that and everything that went into it, that they'd probably want to send him to a contender where he can experience more playoff success than he's had here in New Orleans. And if Jrue Holiday does want to leave, and ultimately I think if he gets traded or not is going to come down to him more so than the team, it's likely because he wants to go to a contender as well. And given the fact that he has a player option on his contract and can opt out, he has some leverage with it. So a team like Denver makes sense. A team like Miami makes a lot of sense too, or the Bucks with Giannis there. All teams that are really looking to make a push to make it to the NBA Finals or to win the NBA Finals are where he'd like to go. I think Denver could send a pretty decent return back if they're willing to include a player like Michael Porter Jr. If the Miami Heat want to include a guy like Tyler Hero in there, I think New Orleans would jump on either of those two deals. I don't know if either of those two teams want to include that sort of player in there, but that's probably the top end of what New Orleans is looking to get. They're going to want a mix of one young player that they think could turn into something really special, so that fits with Tyler Hero, fits with Michael Porter Jr., both guys who've really shown it so far, make you feel really good about their prospects in the NBA. They're also going to want some picks. Miami at least has their pick in this upcoming draft, and then another pick in 2025 that they can trade later. But New Orleans would like that later pick. They don't want a first-round pick in the next season or two. They want to wait further down the line when the Miami Heat might not be title contenders for that first-round pick to be theirs, and it increases in value. Denver's in a bit of a similar situation. Their first-round picks don't look good right now, but in the future they might. And so I think New Orleans would be willing to accept, a decent first-round pick in the next year or two. I think they'd take the young player and then a future first-round pick that who knows what's going to look like. I think that's kind of the best that they're really looking for, and probably the best that they could get, I think, in a trade for Jrue Holiday.
Yep, you brought up a few names and that have been mentioned, of course. Michael Porter Jr., Tyler Hero, I've even heard Vert, when you're talking about Brooklyn. And those are all good young players, but again, it would make you wonder, why would those franchises give up on good young players or include them in deals? And with regard to Michael Porter Jr., look, I did his dad's games at the University of New Orleans. His dad, Michael Porter Sr., is a friend. He's a great guy. And so there's a little bit of knowledge and friendship that exists there. That kid had a little bit of a run-in with his own team this past year, as we saw in the bubble. So maybe there's something there. With regard to Hero, I can't see that based upon the way the kid emerged late in the season and in the bubble and played as well as he did. But you never know. And with LeVert, he's a talented player. From my perspective, any of those three would be wonderful to have on hand. It would give you athleticism, scoring ability on the perimeter. And, of course, the other element that I think this team needs desperately is a rim protector and a center. With all due respect to Favors, who is not that guy. He was a backup in Utah. He's a solid guy. He'll rebound the ball, defend honestly, but he's not going to rim protect, and he's not going to score for you by and large. Is there a center out there that you could fetch in a deal that would make sense and give you that last line of defense that you desperately need and don't have?
I think if you look to the Brooklyn Nets, there's a guy over there in Jared Allen who kind of provides a good bit of that, though I think you've got to worry about him offensively. I don't think he's particularly wonderful in that area. And at that point, I wouldn't be shocked if New Orleans would rather try and roll the dice with Jackson Hayes. Another team to just kind of keep an eye out on that doesn't really fit the conventional mold that we're talking about here is the Atlanta Hawks. That's a team that wants to start contending with a young core and seems to have some pressure from ownership to get into the playoffs sooner rather than later. Jrue Holiday would make a lot of sense for that team, put a defensive guard in the backcourt alongside Trae Young. They've got the 6th pick in this upcoming draft, so they're in a good spot there to potentially trade that. They've got a center in Dwayne Dedman who's a rim protector, doesn't do a whole lot else, but at least gives you that and some rebounding. So he's not going to be a big minutes, a big usage guy, which could work well next to Zion Williamson. And then they've got a couple of other young guys that you could just include in a deal to try and sweeten it. Maybe a guy like Kevin Huerter would make a lot of sense. And so I could see a deal getting done with the Atlanta Hawks.
Just about a minute or two left with Jake Madison. Jake, with regard to Zion Williamson, look, the naked eye tells me he's too big. A lot of people feel the same way. He couldn't guard in space. That was obvious. What do you think happens? Van Gundy obviously is going to command the respective younger players based upon his skins on the wall. Do you think they lay down the law and have a strict prescription for him in terms of what he shows up weighing this year?
I think so. I also think it's what he wants to do. It was definitely an adjustment, I'm sure, for him getting into the NBA with the level of hype that he had around him. We haven't really seen that since LeBron James came into the league. And so I get that question a lot of what does he need to improve upon this offseason? What does he need to come into training camp looking like? The most important thing for him this offseason is not his handle. It's not his jumper. It's not anything like that. It's get that baseline stuff down of what do you need to do to be a professional NBA player with a long career? How do you take care of your body? Do you have a personal chef? Do you have 2 personal chefs like NBA players sometimes do? Are you on some sort of regimen? Things like that just gets that baseline that you can then start to build upon, because if he comes in looking out of shape like he did in the bubble, and he was gone from the bubble for about 2 weeks, and things seem to kind of have the wheels fall off for him a little bit there, you can't have that happen if you want to have a successful career in the NBA and reach the levels of potential that he absolutely has. And so getting all of that just straightened out first, I have no doubt that the Pelicans are really working with him on that and really trying to set him up for success with that, because that's going to be how he takes the next step, and that's going to be how this team gets into the playoffs more so than anyone else, him being consistent all year long and at least improving on the defensive side of the ball and just having more awareness and coming in with a little bit of better shape, I think can definitely help with that. So I expect big things from him. I have no doubt that Stan Van Gundy and the rest of the Pelicans organization is already working with him on that sort of stuff because he is so vital to their success.
Last question. End of the day, is Jrue Holiday with the Pelicans this upcoming season or not?
Yeah, I think he'll be on the team to start the year, but I definitely think he gets moved before the trade deadline. I don't think you'll see anyone come up with those type of offers that the team would accept Tyler Hero or someone else in there until teams get a little bit more desperate around the trade deadline when they can really see what the landscape of the league looks like, and that's where I think you'll see a trade get done.
Locked On Pels podcast does a great job. Of course, follow him on Twitter at NOLA Jake. Jake Madison, thank you so much for visiting. Always a pleasure and enlightening. Keep up the good work.
Of course. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure. That's Jake Madison. We'll take a